It all seems to be over for Keir Starmer one way or another. The papers are full of it. Will he go because Andy Burnham leads a coup against him? Will he go because Wes Streeting wants to be Prime Minister? Will he go because there's a miraculous comeback, a resurrection of Angela Rayner? Or will he simply go, as Dan Hannan points out, because he recognises that it hasn't worked? Whatever happens, this government has no drive, no power, no energy. Keir Starmer, whilst he's in office, is certainly not in power. He cannot drive things through, and the judgment questions over Mandelston will not go away. But this is important constitutionally, because I actually argued, and forgive me quoting an ancient speech, back in September 2010, when we were debating the Fixed Term Parliament Act, that the Constitution was evolving so that a new Prime Minister required a new mandate, a new general election. I said this again, I repeated it when Boris Johnson was forced out, feeling strongly that you need a mandate for a Prime Minister, that this country has become increasingly presidential, and the British voters, having put somebody in, do not expect a cabal in Parliament to put that person out. If you look at what happened to Gordon Brown, his failure to hold an early election damaged his reputation and was one of the reasons he lost the 2010 election. If you look at the chaos in the Tory party after Boris Johnson was forced out, and the difficulty for both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak to govern was because neither of them had a mandate from the people. Yes, we're a constitutional democracy, but that sits atop a democratic system that requires the Prime Minister of the day to have the support of the electorate given to him or her, not her very often with the Labour Party, it so happens, if ever, by the voters. Now, this is really important because if you read what Mr. Burnham may be thinking about, he's hoping that some friendly Labour MP will stand aside, or Labour MP with a scandal behind him will be forced aside to make way for him to get into Parliament, to be hailed as the conquering hero, to have the entry into London with palm leaves laid before him as we welcome him as a new and popular leader for the Labour Party. Well, all I can say to that is vanity of vanities, all is vanity and chasing after the wind. That if Mr. Burnham thinks that the British people will tolerate the idea that somebody who is not even in Parliament can then suddenly become a leader of the country, can become Prime Minister with no popular mandate at all, then he's got delusions. And he doesn't seem to have delusions from his previous political career. Any by-election would be set up not simply as Labour against reform in that particular part of the world, assuming he goes for a Manchester seat. It will be put as Labour against the country, Labour against democracy, Labour against a government deserving, needing, requiring a mandate to be able to govern. It would be a fundamental constitutional challenge, and people going to the polling stations in that by-election would not be thinking, is this going to be the best local MP? They will be thinking, is it an abuse of our system to put somebody in so that he can run the country when the rest of the country isn't getting a word in, isn't able to be consulted about this issue? And I think this is fundamentally important. And if you look at our constitution has always evolved. That you go back to Queen Anne being the last monarch to veto a bill. Now, Bagehot said in the 19th century that the monarch would effectively have to sign his own death warrant if Parliament passed it. That has evolved. There's never been a change in law that has required it. The office of Prime Minister has evolved. First of all, the post of Lord High Treasurer was taken into commission, so you had a First Lord of the Treasury, a Second Lord, and so on. And that First Lord, being in charge of money, became the Prime Minister. You then had the evolution of the Cabinet. The Cabinet is still a committee of the Privy Council. It has the power of the Privy Council, but the King, the sovereign, does not attend it. It makes decisions without the immediate presence of the sovereign, whereas the Privy Council requires the sovereign to be there, to be the person leading and authorising the actions of the Privy Council. This evolved in the 18th and through to the 19th century, but so did our democracy evolve. So you have a form of representative government, you have the accident of the 40 shilling freeholders becoming more common because 40 shillings, £2 in new money, is inflated away. So you get many, many more coming in, and therefore you have more and more electors in particularly county elections. Boroughs were controlled, but you also had the free elections in places like Westminster. And the counties with the wider electorate had greater status than the boroughs. An MP for a county was a knight from the shire, was a more distinguished figure than somebody who'd got in through a rotten borough, and this was widely accepted in the 18th century. Then in 1832, you have the Reform Bill that brings a bit of logic to it, broadly expands the franchise, not entirely. As it happens, it's in 1832 that women lose the right to vote. A very small number of women had the right to vote before 1832, but it's cancelled in the Great Reform Bill. Then 1867, the further widening of the vote until by the early stage of the 20th century, everybody gets the vote. This was an evolution. And you see the evolution also in the relationship between the Lords and the Commons. The whole idea of a finance bill came about in the time of Gladstone because putting individual bills to the House of Lords had become difficult. They voted down a printed papers tax, if I remember rightly, and so Gladstone consolidated it into a finance bill, which the Lords by precedent would not vote down until they did. They broke the precedent in 1909, leading to the Parliament Act 1911, which was amended in 1949. Again, you see, it evolves, but today the relationship between the Lords and the Commons is primarily one of convention. The Parliament Act is used extremely rarely, but the government tends to get its business through the House of Lords. That they pass amendments, but they usually back down when those amendments are sent back to them for reconsideration. Sometimes ping pong goes on a little, but these are conventions, these are not statutes. And that's where I come to this really important evolution. And people have complained about being more presidential all the way back to Lloyd George, saying that the Prime Minister was taking on a presidential appearance and a presidential approach and was becoming too powerful, was no longer simply primus inter pares, first among equals, but was the boss, so to speak. But that's the reality. And you and I know that when we go to the polling station, we're not voting for Mr. or Miss Snodgrass. We are voting for the party and the leader who will be in office. That is so crucial to the decision making. I have no doubt that in 1997 people voted for Tony Blair. He did better than any other Labour leader would have done. In 2010, they voted actively for David Cameron. Unquestionably, in 2019, they voted for Boris Johnson, although they also voted against Jeremy Corbyn. In 2017, many people had voted for Jeremy Corbyn. Fortunately, from my point of view, not enough. And therefore, you get to 2024, and people were voting for Keir Starmer and not for Rishi Sunak. Leaders matter. Leaders are the determining factor. I remember talking to backbench MPs when I was helping Boris. Didn't succeed in the end, but I wanted to keep him in office. And I remember one saying to me that it wasn't Boris who had won his seat for him. He'd done it himself by his own efforts. This man, this rather self-important fellow, is not an MP any longer and wouldn't have won anything on his own. He needed that oomph of Boris Johnson to get over the line, as did we all, and to get that majority. Now, you may say Keir Starmer never had much oomph, but think back to last year. He was seen as a safe pair of hands, a steady Eddie, that somebody who would do the job reasonably well, cautiously, would be competent. There was an optimism about him, and that's part of the reason he won such a big majority, because people cast their votes much as anything to get rid of the Tories, but recognising the beneficiary of that was Starmer. So if he goes, then there is no mandate for a new government. There really isn't. There needs to be a new general election. And if Labour believe that it can parachute in a new leader in a conveniently orchestrated by-election, then they'll be taking us for granted. The sheer arrogance of that will be so great. And how are they going to do it anyway? At the moment, the proposal is one of two things. One, that Burnham would stand in a seat vacated by somebody who was extraordinarily rude about his constituents. Well, that's a really silly way to try and get back into Parliament. The unpopularity of Labour in that seat must be pretty high. It's a sort of godsend to Nigel Farage to say, well, why don't you just try and take this seat? The other proposal is somebody, a distinguished Labour member, may stand down to make way for him. But voters will be angry about that too, because you're put in for 5 years. You're not put in to waltz off whenever you feel like it. So it will appear arrogant and vain and contemptuous of the electorate if Labour thinks it can just parachute somebody in. And even if Labour just changes with somebody who's already in the House of Commons, they will be extremely foolish not to have a general election, because that person will have no mandate either. And governing without a mandate is extraordinarily difficult, regardless of the size of the majority. Why did Rishi Sunak find it so difficult to govern? Because he had a majority but no mandate. No one had voted for him, and MPs therefore thought that they could do what they like, and they looked at their own seats and wanted to preserve those rather than looking at what the Prime Minister said, because he'd never won an election. He didn't have that authority, that black spot that gave him the right to do things. And any successor to Starmer would be in that position. So that is the difficulty that they are facing at the moment. It's a real problem for them. Starmer is in the deepest of deep water, but a replacement probably means they're out of office. Thank you for watching. I'm not quite sure who came in as I was speaking, a little interruption. It was either a wife or a child, but they're always welcome to join my videos too. I must do one with Mary and we can talk a bit more about reform with her. Anyway, thank you for watching, and do watch again in future.